Well, thanks for coming to this video. What I'll be doing is breaking down the first episode of Lovecraft Country titled Sundown. So I'll be giving a brief synopsis, including spoilers, and I'll also be showcasing some of the Easter eggs that occurred in the episode, so you can sort of get an idea of some of the things that you might have missed. And so it'll be more helpful if you've already watched the episode, but if you haven't watched the episode, hopefully this video will give you a little bit of an idea of the major pieces of what's happened. And so we open the episode with Atticus, our main character, fighting in a war in black and white. And, it looks like a standard sort of World War I, Korean War sort of scenario. There are bombs flying overhead and he's in the trench. And so he comes out of this trench and it switches to from black and white to color. And when it switches to color, we get this sort of pan out of the entire plane of the war, and we see like spaceships flying. We see a spaceship sort of like using a laser beam on, like, causing fields of fire. Like the entire war zone is like on fire. And we also see like this giant winged beast sort of fly across the sky. And while we see sort of Atticus looking at all of this stuff in the sky, we're hearing this sort of like this conversation taking place. What is it? Sort of, "Hey, black boy, I want to talk to you for a second." And so what that actually is it's a clip of the 1950s movie, The Jackie Robinson Story, which makes sense because in the next frame, after the red woman comes down from the sky, we see Jackie Robinson fighting this winged creature. And so it's really an interesting play on sort of the story that he's reading, and maybe it's the movie that he previously watched, because, we find out a little bit later that this was all a dream that's taking place. And so it really sets the stage for the episode as a whole and for the series as a whole in terms of sort of humans encountering these sort of space creatures. And then it's also a cool play on the other things going on in his mind. So we have him probably just seeing the Jackie Robinson Story. So we also get an idea of what time this is taking place. And so it's set sometime in the 1950s. So then the bus breaks down because, they're on the bus and they're headed from Kentucky to Chicago, which is Atticus, also known as Tick's hometown. The bus breaks down and, Tick sits down and decides to read a little bit more of the book. And then when the substitute replacement bus comes, it's not actually a bus, but it's like a flatbed truck. Looking at the flatbed truck, like Tick is seeing the people get on the truck and noticing that there's no segregated section. Sort of the conclusion is they won't be getting on that truck. And he and the older woman who was sitting with him in the colored section are forced to walk the rest of the way of the route to Chicago. In that time, we get to have a little bit more of conversation about what Tick has been reading on the bus, and we find out the name of the book is called A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And this is an interesting part too, because Edgar Rice Burroughs is also known for writing these sort of space war fantasy fiction novels. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, according to some of the things that I've looked up, was actually kind of influential on H.P. Lovecraft. So it's interesting to have his inclusion there. So we're not sort of just directly saying everything is inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. We're sort of getting sort of that genre as opposed to just that one specific author. So another interesting thing to note once they start talking about A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs is that the protagonist's name is John Carter. And so let's jump back to the beginning of the episode. So what we're actually seeing play out is a section from the Princess of Mars story in his mind. And so if you actually look behind Atticus, when the Red Woman is flying down, there's actually a fight taking place between a human soldier and a Mars soldier. He has red skin. He's dressed in sort of this Roman gear. And so Atticus in that dream is living out a scene from the Princess of Mars book, and also sort of being inundated with quips and characters from the Jackie Robinson story from the 1950s movie. But jumping back to that conversation, we find out that John Carter, the protagonist of A Princess of Mars, is actually an ex-Confederate soldier. But, and this is really true, in the Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, John Carter is the hero. He's the person that we're supposed to root for. He's the person that's sort of saving Mars and gets the girl, and that's the hero. And so the older black woman is sort of clear to point out that there's a contradiction in someone who fought for slavery on planet Earth and goes to Mars and becomes a hero, and that, you know, he as a black person is sort of aspiring to it or loving it. And Atticus sort of explains how, you know, people have their flaws, but we learn to love them, and that older black woman is right to point out that, you know, fighting for slavery isn't a flaw, that's, you know, you're a bad person. You can't be a hero somewhere else. And that's me skipping on. We then go to Chicago. So there's this thing that happens where we do this sort of flyaway, let you know we're in Chicago, there's a block party happening. You're getting an idea of sort of what 1950s Chicago looks like in a black neighborhood, and it looks like I would have a great time there. We zoom into Uncle George and Aunt Hippolyta, and they're in bed. You would recognize Aunt Hippolyta, played by Jurnee Ellis, and, you know, she played the matriarch in the Clark Sisters biopic that was on Lifetime. And so that's where you would recognize her face from. So they're in bed, they're having a conversation. George is a writer, a travel guide writer. So he writes about safe passages on the map. So basically what George does is he writes the Green Book. In the Green Book, if you've known of sort of the Oscar-winning film, is about sort of this writer, or basically the Green Book is a guide for black people when they're traveling. So they know the places that are safe and the places to avoid. And so Uncle George is the person that sort of does these road trips and maps out the places that are safe and the places that are dangerous for a black person to visit. And so he's preparing for a next trip. In that conversation, we also find out that Aunt Hippolyta writes for the Green Book as well, and he helps Uncle George, but she writes it based on the notes that he takes. She never actually goes on any of the trips, and so she makes this sort of suggestion that maybe she should be able to go on one of the trips. You know, she's contributing to the book, but she's not getting the credit, and it would be nice, you know, if she could sort of do something more. George brushes it off, blah, blah, blah. And they have sex. And so then at that time, we sort of skip to the living room, and there's an interesting thing that happened that I missed. Dee, their daughter, the daughter of George and Hippolyta, is actually working on a drawing. And the drawing, as she's looking at her mother, a picture of her mother as a god. That'll be important later because we jump to the finished comic, and we learn that that comic is the Orinthia Blue comic that she's working on. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just make a little note that Orinthia Blue is inspired by Dee's mother, and that would be Aunt Hippolyta. So Tick arrives home, he greets them, and then we cut to the scene. They give us that little bit where Tick is coming into the auto shop. They pan by the store window and you see the Green Book guide. And so that sort of puts the two and two together for us, that what George is writing goes into the Green Book, and that's, you know, what he does. So Uncle George writes the travel guide, the Green Book, and it requires him to go on road trips. And so he's in the auto shop getting a tune-up, obviously in preparation for his next road trip. Tick comes in and visits, and he notices that there's a lot of books in the shop. The book that he picks out is The Outsiders and Others. I believe that's the title, by H.P. Lovecraft. So this is the first time that we have a direct sort of reference to H.P. Lovecraft and H.P. Lovecraft's works. He turns the book to the side, and you notice that the publishing house, so when a book publishes something, usually the publishing house is featured on the spine of the book. And in this case, it is featured in it's Arkham House. And Arkham House Publishing is a real thing, and they do publish the H.P. Lovecraft stories. So all that's sort of real life accuracy. When Uncle George notices that Tick has picked out that book, he sort of is surprised that Tick would be interested in those books as well. But apparently Tick has always been interested in those books. His father just didn't appreciate it. We learned that his father didn't like Tick reading those books because H.P. Lovecraft is a racist. And that's actual history as well. Something that's not often talked about is sort of, while H.P. Lovecraft created this lore that has influenced sort of modern storytelling when it comes to aliens, he was also a very vocal and very well-known racist and anti-Semitist. So they talk about one of the poems that he wrote on the creation of niggers, which is a real poem that he wrote, which basically talks about how black people are the in-between between humans and beasts. And so we're neither beasts nor are we humans, we're the in-between. And it's sort of the discussion about how God created us as in that in-between. Very racist, very problematic. And so, you kind of understand why Tick's father wouldn't want him to read those kind of books. They're sitting down having a conversation. Well, they're not sitting down, but, that leads into the conversation about why Tick is back. George hasn't seen his father, or George hasn't seen Tick's father in 2 weeks. Tick got a letter from his father that he tells George about, and it basically says that he's learned more about Tick's mother's ancestry and her right of birth, and he wants him to come visit and find out more or explore more about his mother's history in Arkham, Maryland. And so that's another triggering point because, as we sort of just found out, Arkham is known as the publisher of H.P. Lovecraft stories. The Northeast is also called Lovecraft Country. Lovecraft Country also called Arkham County or Arkham Country. So all these pieces are fitting into place, and so he's really sort of perked up by the idea that, like, this setting for these H.P. Lovecraft books is an actual real thing. George doesn't believe him. George asks, and so there's this interesting thing that happens. This is another thing that I want to sort of point out. George asks to see the letter, and he looks at the letter a little bit more closely under sort of a reading glass or a reading pane. And when he looks at it, he's like, oh, this doesn't say Arkham, this says Arkham, Maryland, or Arkham, Massachusetts. But if you look at this piece of paper closely and look at this note, you'll see that it looks like, you could make a case that it was a K and then they rewrote a D over it, sort of how someone misspells and they don't cross it out, they just sort of like change the letter. And that's what I see here, and I think that that's like a little Easter egg to the fact that, his father is also sort of aware of what's happening. And I think sort of one thing that I wanted to point out in this review is sort of this this line throughout the entire episode of this family being one that is really into literacy and literature and books and reading. And so we see that later when Tick visits his father's house and sees that his father's reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And so one thing that this entire family shares is sort of a love of knowledge, and they're passing that down to his children. So we see this being passed down as Dee being sort of this writer and creator of stories, and Tick being this sort of voracious reader. So they've definitely sort of pushed the importance of sort of reading and literature and information throughout the family. After that conversation finishes between George and Tick, Tick goes to the Denmark Vesey bar, which is apparently the watering hole for his father. Denmark Vesey was executed for leading a rebellion in South Carolina. So the name of that bar sort of indicates that, one, it's a black bar, and two, it's safe for black patrons. And we do find out, yes, it's owned by a black owner, and actually it's owned by a black gay man. And we find that out because he's getting head in the alleyway. Tick sort of pries the guy from information. He says he hasn't seen his father the last time in about 2 weeks. The last time he saw him, he was with a white man in a silver car, and that's the first reference we get to this silver car that makes an appearance several times throughout the episode. In the next scene, we sort of drop the Tick George father storyline, and we sort of pick up the Letitia Lewis storyline. So Letty, played by Jurnee Smollett Bell, sort of arrives on the scene, and it's at night. There's a block party, and first assumption is she's a camera woman, or she's she enjoys taking pictures, because she gets out of her taxi and she's sort of making her way to the stage, taking pictures the entire while. So there's a woman singing on the stage, taking requests, and we find out that that is Ruby, and that's Letty's sister. They do a duet, and there's a little bit of tension there that we don't really get to explore until after they finish singing. Um, and Ruby's not really pleased to see Letty because apparently whenever she does see Letty, it's asking for money or asking for something. And sure enough, Letty's in town because she's out of work and she's looking for work and she needs a place to stay. In the meantime, Ruby offers her 2 nights at her place, and that's it. They have some issues because Letty didn't attend their mother's funeral, and apparently the funeral put a hardship on Ruby, and so she's out of the nicer place she was living in, and now she's sort of staying in like a halfway house. And so apparently the death of Letty and Ruby's mother was the source of some tension in that family. After that scene is over, we skip back to the George and Tick storyline. At this point, they're sort of talking about the information that George has collected about Arkham County, and apparently it hasn't been on the U.S. Census in 200 years. And the last known sort of vicinity of Arkham County is Devon County, Massachusetts. So they're going to go to Devon. So Tick is going to go to Devon County. George isn't going to let him go alone. George is going to go on a Green Book ride anyway. So they decide, we'll just make that the stop. And so they both agree to go to Arkham, or to find Arkham, Massachusetts, and they're going to start by going to Devon County. Another interesting thing to note here is the atlas, the actual atlas that George is using. And so it's illustrated with different things on different pages. And so there are illustrations of Klansmen, there are actual illustrations of werewolves. And so basically it looks like Dee has maybe taken the notes from George and also sort of just the reading and learning that she's picked up and sort of illustrated this atlas at various places. And to note that when we look at Devon County, it's illustrated with the Grim Reaper and a clock at midnight. And so that's a little disturbing for George and for us as the viewer. In my first watch, I thought it was a Klan member, but it's actually just the Grim Reaper, which I guess is not as bad. So then we take a little time from that story, and then we're with Tick by himself. Tick goes to his father's place, plays a little jazz, and is looking around the house. And that's where we see Tick pick up the Count of Monte Cristo book. And then we also sort of see the liquor in the house. We also see some holes in the wall. So if you look at sort of the walls, Tick takes a little time to observe, and you can see that there's some evidence of violence in the house and sort of scuffles. It sort of alludes to scuffles between Tick and his father, and also alludes to sort of Tick's father's attitude. Tick also pulls out from the Count of Monte Cristo book a picture of him as a child with his mother and father. So it's kind of like, there were some happy times, and then we also finally see what Tick's mother looks like. Tick goes into the bedroom, pulls out, he finds the gun that apparently has been stored in his father's closet, and then he makes a phone call. And so when he calls the operator and he's giving out these numbers, he goes way past 7. So we know that he's not calling a domestic line. And the operator confirms this by saying South Korea. So apparently when George was in the war, he met a woman over there that he formed some sort of relationship with. We don't know if it's romantic or friendship or otherwise, but we know that it was close enough for him to call her from Chicago. And apparently she's aware of Tick's intentions and tells him you shouldn't have done that, and he hangs up quickly, and we don't really get to explore that much. But put a pin in that. It'll definitely become a major part of the story later. Maybe not a major part, but it'll definitely play a role in the story as it moves on. Okay, so it's the next day. Tick pulls up to Uncle George's place and sees Letty unloading the truck, and we find out through some conversation that Letty will be going with George and Tick to Devon County because sort of in the midway point, Letty's brother lives there, and she's going to stay with him for a little while. Letty's brother can also give them a little bit more information about Devon County and about Ardmore County as their travels go along. So it makes sense to stop at Letty's brother's place, and she only had 2 nights at Ruby's, and so she has to keep moving and finding a place to go. Hippolyta and Dee are doing the travel check, sort of just making sure that they have everything that they need for the trip. And apparently there is what's the word I'm looking for? A habit or a routine or a custom, let's call it that. A custom of for every trip George takes, Dee writes a road trip comic to go along with it. And that road trip comic has usually been Panther Man, but we see that Dee has wrote a new comic called Orinthia Blue. Now, I said to remember that image of Dee illustrating earlier because this is the completed work that she was drawing at the beginning of the episode. And so she's written a new comic book based on her mother, which is interesting. And so we don't know this yet, but I'm just wondering if maybe Panther Man was based on George. And now after some time and some influence, Dee is more inspired by her mother. And so she's writing Orinthia Blue. We also sort of find out later in the episode that her mother is very into sort of the planets and the constellations. She's in the kitchen with the telescope while George is being explained the story of Orinthia Blue. So Orinthia Blue is based on Hippolyta. So now we're off and we're on a road trip and we're going through the Midwest, headed to the Northeast, and what's taking place here, we're sort of getting this montage of travel and we're seeing them experiencing racism and different stops along the way. At one point, Tick is heckled by a gas station attendant. There's a separate colored and white space to get ice cream. And so, racism isn't just pervasive in the South. We still have sort of these Jim Crow laws that are pervasive in the Midwest and the North. And overlaid with that is James Baldwin's speech. James Baldwin is giving a speech, which is actually from a debate that James Baldwin had with William F. Buckley in 1965. And it's sort of about, black people's sort of place in American society and sort of the history of American society and how we sort of rectify that ugly history. So it's interesting to sort of combine the two, sort of this discussion by James Baldwin, who sort of is known for his conversations around race and America's history with racism and relationship with it, and sort of these examples of racism and how it plays out in sort of the 1950s world. I'm still assuming here that this is set in the 1950s. So we get to one of the sort of best scenes, I think, of this episode. They decide to take a detour and go to Somerville because they haven't, had a hot meal in a while. They've been on the road, as evidenced by Tick basically doing like a whole bath in the forest. So we know that they've been on the road for a while and they've been sort of slumming it. And so they decide, it would be nice to take a load off. Let's go get breakfast or lunch somewhere. So George, looking at the Green Book, finds a safe place in the Somerville Diner, or Somerville, and they decide to go to Somerville. And when they get there, what you might have missed, what I missed on my first watch but caught on the second watch, is that next to, so one of the things that you might not have seen, when they're pulling up to the restaurant, next to the restaurant, you see a building that was, obviously, it has burn marks, it's boarded up, and there are burn marks at the top of it. And so it sort of says that, at some point this building was on fire. So they get there and they notice that the name of the restaurant is changed. And so they go in anyway. George is sort of just asserting his right to eat wherever they want to. There's a really sort of eerie vibe because the waiter doesn't say anything, he disappears. Come to find out, the original restaurant was burned down because it served black people. And so Tick sort of finds that when we see the scorched floorboard, and so that pairs with the burn marks that you saw in the building outside to the right of the restaurant. So apparently this place was burned down to the ground and rebuilt. And it was rebuilt, well, it was burned down to the ground because it served black people and it was rebuilt. So then you see Letty gunning it out of the backroom kitchen area saying, we need to go. They get in the car, they're driving and they're being shot at. So obviously, they didn't need to be told that they weren't welcome. There's another thing that I want to highlight, just as a soft detour. one of the other things that I think is pervasive throughout this episode is sort of how Black people respond to horror or respond to danger. I don't need to be told that this is a threat. I recognize that there's a threat. Let me remove myself. That also takes place a little bit later on in the show. But, you know, they're very cognizant of when they're in danger, and they immediately make steps to remove themselves from that danger. And so that's how they were able to get away from the gunmen that were trying to kill them, was because, you know, they recognized the threat before the threat arrived. So the next time that we see the silver Bentley, because we had seen it once after George's conversation with Tick, and that was the first time that we ever saw it. And then we see that same car that basically saves their lives. Sort of it intervenes between the trio and the gunman, and some sort of force field happens that forces the car with the racist to flip over and sort of kills all of them. This white woman, sort of impeccably dressed, steps out, doesn't say anything, and again, sort of recognizing danger when you see it, they just gun it, no questions asked. And then we finally arrive to Letty's brother's house. So they're having a conversation. Letty's brother is giving them information that he's found out about Devon County, how not only are people sort of disappearing, but there's also a sheriff there, Sheriff Eustace Johnson, who has multiple complaints from the NAACP. So this is sort of good information for the group to have as they travel that way. You know, they know what sort of dangers that are in store for them, both, I mean, mythological and sort of human dangers of dealing with racist police in racist counties. There's an argument between Letty and her brother, and he's upset because he gave Letty money that she was using to help friends bail out of jail. And we don't get to explore why those friends were in jail. Letty wants to explain that, but she's sort of cut off. So thinking about this time period, my assumption is that she's bailing these people out because they're protesters fighting for civil rights. So that leads to an argument, and also there's bad blood between Letty and her brother because she didn't go to the funeral. So apparently Ruby and her brother did. Letty skipped out on it. She's been using money from both of them. She was going to try to stay at his place, and that argument just didn't go well, so he kicks her out. And that's why you see Letty continue on with them, because she's no longer welcome at her brother's house. So now we're on our way. We made it to Devon County, and the group is sort of lost in the woods on this trail. So when they get out to catch their bearings, they hear a rustling. Letty doesn't know what it is, and then Tick playfully suggests that it's maybe a shoggoth, which is an H.P. Lovecraftian creature, an actual real one, sort of mentioned in the stories. That's sort of this massive creature with eyes all over its body. And you know, Letty goes, you know, well, I'm not worried about that. We can outrun a shoggoth. And then, you know, Tick says, well, Uncle George can't outrun a sloth. So jumping back, when we see that conversation between Tick and Uncle George, and George is icing his knee and telling us the story about how his knees are jacked up because he was beaten outside of a place. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, Uncle George not only is old, but he also has bad knees. So yeah, he can't run. And we sort of see that later on. So there are all these gems that are being dropped at the beginning that are sort of being played out at the end, which is sort of a definition of an example of really great writing. So that conversation about the shoggoth is interrupted when Sheriff Johnson, the one that they've been told to watch out for, actually shows up. And he basically threatens to murder them if they don't get out of the county. And they only have 7 minutes to do so. There's no way that they can do it going north. So it forces them to go back south. And they make it over the county line to Worcester with like 10 seconds to spare. Only Sheriff Johnson has alerted the sheriffs in that county to be on the lookout for them. They're suspected for robberies in the area. And so one of the things that happens is that Tick addresses Sheriff Johnson by his actual name, and he was never given it, which sort of jacks up the narrative that they're visiting. You know, if you're visiting from Chicago, why would you know the name of a sheriff in Massachusetts? And so that information sort of worked against them in that moment. And, you know, it also was a moment where Tick was being a little bit too smart for his own good, and sort of that backfired on him. Luckily, the three aren't killed because they were literally about to be, because they're ambushed. The entire party is ambushed by shoggoths that eat a couple of the sheriffs, and all hell breaks loose. Letty and Tick jump up and take off sprinting, no questions asked, again alluding to a black person's response to horror is to remove yourself from the horror. But also, you know, when things go left, you know, you hit the deck and you wait it out. And that's what George does. So he sort of lays low, literally lays flat until everything goes down. But again, there's no way that Uncle George would have been able to sprint to that cabin the way that Letty and Tick were able to. And, you know, we were sort of alluded to that because, you know, Tick said that as much, you know, when they were standing on the road. So they make it to the cabin. George eventually does make it to the cabin. He has a flashlight that he takes from like a severed arm of one of the sheriffs. And he runs into a shoggoth, and the flashlight sort of keeps him from being attacked. And so when he gets there, Tick and Letty are there with two sheriffs, Sheriff Johnson and another sheriff from Worcester County. Sheriff Johnson has been bit, and basically his shoulder is gone. And at that point, George sort of realizes that he wasn't attacked because of the light, and the shoggoths have weaknesses similar to vampires where they're very sort of sensitive to light. And they just need to figure out if they can get another light source and wait it out until morning. Letty suggests if they use Woody, the car's headlights, you know, if they could get to the car, bring the car down and shine the headlights, they can just keep those on until morning. The car is a quarter of a mile away. Tick volunteers to go. Sheriff Johnson absolutely doesn't allow that, and he instead sends Letty to go without a flashlight, to go this quarter of a mile to Woody to get the car, bring it back with the headlights on, and save everyone. So another instance of Black excellence is Letty's sprint a quarter of a mile to this car without being attacked, without stumbling, without looking back. You know, it's a really great moment, and it's a really interesting deviation from sort of the damsel in distress trope, especially when it comes to horror movies or horror films and running. Women often fall and often are attacked, and that is not the case here. So Letty gets the car. She gets to the car and she's safe. She takes a picture of the shoggoth, of one of the shoggoths when she's attacked, and that flash from the camera sort of forces the shoggoth to flee. I'm putting a pin in. I'm personally deciding to put a pin in that moment of her taking a picture of that shoggoth, because now that picture is in her camera roll, and at some point it can be developed. So no matter how many times, you know, people don't believe them, she has hardcore evidence of this creature existing. So while that's happening, while she's making it to the car, Sheriff Johnson is transforming into a shoggoth, because apparently there's some alternative similarities to vampires. So not only are shoggoths sensitive to light, but if a shoggoth bites you, you turn into a shoggoth. And so we see that transformation take place. Sheriff Johnson eats the other sheriff. Tick picks up one of the shotguns and shoots him, but it doesn't really stop the sheriff. And before he can attack, Letty drives Woody through the cabin, knocking down the sheriff. And the headlights keep him from attacking further. He jumps out a window. So then they put flares out all around. So they've gone through all of their sort of travel preparation kit, and the flares sort of provide light that keep the shoggoths at a distance. But what sends them away is sort of this high-pitched whistle out in the distance that we don't know where it comes from. We don't know why it's affecting the shoggoths, but they all decide to disperse. So the next time that we see them, it's in the morning, and they're walking now, because we can assume that Woody is totaled from driving through the cabin, and they're walking under the covered bridge that I also say we should put a pin on, because this covered bridge separates Devon County from Arnhem County. So once they get through the bridge, they're officially in Arnhem County, and we roll upon this sort of grand mansion on this sort of pristine estate. They're walking up to the mansion, and they note that the silver car that we saw in Chicago, that we saw sort of save their lives on the road, is now in the driveway of this mansion. They get to the door. Before they can even knock, the door swings open and they say that they've been expecting Tick. And that's where the show ends, where that episode ends. So like I said, I think that there are some really cool nuggets there. I think a lot of this plays a part in, or will play a part in the next episode. Let me know if I missed anything, if you saw any other sort of little cool nuggets that we should point out and sort of make note of, especially as we go throughout the series. It's great writing, the acting is really good, and I think it's a really elaborate story. I think this review breakdown was a bit long because there is so much to unpack, in this 1 hour plus episode. So look for my next review or breakdown on episode 2, and then I'll also have a video of sort of the explanations of the Lovecraft Country book that this TV show is based on, more information about H.P. Lovecraft and his sort of lore and his sort of notoriety for being racist, and how all that's going to play together in this show. So thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.